Okay, Jennifer Wilson will be talking to us about redistricting today, and she is the Deputy Director of the League of Women Voters of New York. She has a master's degree in public administration, focused in public management and politics. She's a lobbyist extraordinaire and fills many roles in the League of Women Voters, and we're thrilled that you came back after leaving us for a little while. You're an incredible asset to the League of Women Voters.
Thank
So
you.
thank you for doing this for us.
Yeah, great. Well, I do have a PowerPoint slide deck, so we will have some slides that hopefully will make it a lot easier to understand than me just lecturing and rambling off facts about redistricting. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with those slides. And we can definitely share these after, so you all can post them on your website and share them out. And anyone's welcome to use this slide deck. The real goal of our redistricting campaign is to engage as many people as possible in New York State in redistricting, and to educate as many people as possible about what the process is and how they can actually be involved in the process. But this is my Redistricting 101 class. So we start at the very basic bottom. What is redistricting? Redistricting is a process that happens every 10 years after the decennial census to give us a little bit of a gut check on where people are living in the United States and make sure that congressional apportionment is actually fairly representing all of the different states. So it happens at the congressional level, it happens at the state level, and then it also happens at the county and municipal level. And that process varies throughout New York State, as I have learned. There are even some areas of New York State that do not do redistricting because they're all at-large seats. There are areas of New York State that have independent commissions. There are areas of New York State where the county legislature draws the line. It really varies a lot. But luckily, the state and congressional process is very clear-cut and straightforward, but it has changed since the last time we had redistricting. So what does redistricting look like in New York State? 10 years ago, we had a legislative task force on redistricting. This was essentially a task force that was appointed by the legislature that worked as legislative staff that would draw the lines for the seated legislature. This task force would draw both the state assembly and senate and congressional maps for the entire state. However, even though they had the power to do that, most often they would hand over the maps for Congress to the court and just have the courts draw the maps instead. So this was basically seated incumbent legislators hiring their own staff to draw lines for them. And as you might imagine, this was not an ideal process. It allowed for a lot of gerrymandering, a lot of cracking and packing, which I have some slides on because I feel like cracking and packing gets tossed around so much. And even when I started looking into redistricting, it took me a lot of visual aids to fully understand what is meant by cracking and packing. Cracking essentially spreads out voters of a certain party, of a certain political ideology, or a certain community of interest. So whether that is a minority community or an ethnic community, and it spreads out their vote over multiple districts so that their voting power is not as strong as the other people living in that district because there's only a few of them versus there's a lot of the other kind of people. And then packing is exactly the opposite. We're going to take all of the people of this party, of this group, and we're going to put them into one district so that even though they might be entitled to multiple districts, they're only going to get a single district and therefore a single voice at the state legislature or in Congress. So I have a couple of images here that kind of lay that out, but I think the next two slides are better representations. So in the first slide, we have 60% of our people are purple people and 40% of our people are gray people. And in the first example, we see purple gets all of the districts, even though really they should have at least one district. And then in the second example, purple only gets one of the districts and gray gets two, even though technically purple should be the one with two and gray should be the one with one. And then in my last image, which is probably the most sort of clear, straightforward, clear cut, we've got 60% blue and 40% red. In the first example, we have perfect representation. We've got 3 blue districts and 2 red districts. In the second one, we have unfairly all blue districts and no red districts. In that scenario, they've been spread out over multiple districts, the red, so that they don't have any representation. And then the last district, we also have 2 blue districts and 3 red districts. And this is our packing. We packed all of the blue into 2 districts so that red has more districts, even though technically they should not. So I'm gonna leave that up for a second so people can kind of digest, because like I said, this was the thing that really got me when I was looking into redistricting, was what the heck is cracking and packing? So looking at our old maps, we can kind of see how that cracking and packing worked, particularly upstate, I think, is where you really see the examples of diluting votes or packing votes into one area. And if you might recall, if you follow state politics at all, at the time, the Senate was controlled by Republicans and the Democrats were controlled, or the assembly rather, the lower house was controlled by Democrats, and they wanted to keep it that way. And in an ideal world, the Republicans would like to have both houses controlled by them, and the Democrats would like to have both houses controlled by them. But that was just how it was at the time. And because they had the power to redistrict, they were able to keep it that way, even though that may not necessarily have been how the state was actually looking in terms of voter representation. So at the time, our old redistricting guidelines were really loose. There wasn't really clear guidelines over what should be done. We had compact and contiguous, which I do have definitions for on a later slide, but really that was the only standard that we had. There was also a certain margin of voters that had to be within each district, but because it was the legislature drawing their own maps, they didn't usually follow the rules. And I believe it was the last 7 redistricting cycles in New York State, maps were challenged. So it was not as if this was going unnoticed, but even though there was court challenges happening, it wasn't making things any better. And as you can see from the visual example, our New York State maps look crazy, particularly the Senate maps look really, really crazy. So in 2014, there was a constitutional amendment put forward to amend this process and take it away from the legislature and instead form a quote unquote independent redistricting commission. This was a constitutional amendment that was created by the legislature, of course, because they were ultimately the ones who had to put it forward. They voted to approve it. The way constitutional amendments work is there has to be one statewide election in between. Then they had to vote to approve it again. And then we as the voters actually voted it into law, or into the Constitution rather, in 2014. And this amendment gave clear criteria for drawing new lines. It protected all of the parties so that there wasn't just the majority party in either house having all of the power. It mandated a minimum level of transparency and also of citizen input. And it established firm deadlines so that the commission had to have maps by a certain time so that we weren't just going beyond when we needed the maps and having maps come out really late. So let's take a look at what some of these new mandates are. So first of all, the structure itself has really changed. So instead of having this task force that is basically legislative staff, now we have 10-member commission. Now I will admit that the commission is appointed by the legislature, half of, or not half, but 3/4 of it. So it is 4 of the appointees. It's 2 from each of the houses, majority and minority party, to be a total of 8. So it's 2 Senate Republicans, 2 Senate Democrats, 2 Assembly Republicans, and 2 Assembly Democrats. That's how many appointees they each get. And then those 8 come together and then they nominate the final 2 members of the commission who cannot be a member of either of the major parties. So they cannot be a Democrat or a Republican. And I have on here too the voting rules around those appointees as well. So again, making sure that one party isn't necessarily in control. So digging a little deeper into the rules around who can be a commissioner, the commissioners cannot have been a legislator, either of the New York State legislature or of Congress or a statewide official, the spouse of an elected official in any of those levels of government, a state employee or state officer or a legislative employee, a registered lobbyist, or a political party chairman within the last 3 years. And then to even further drive home the importance of making sure these commissioners are not going to be in the pocket of anyone in particular, the members are supposed to represent what New York State looks like in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, language, and also in terms of geography. So here's a quick look at the commissioners that we have right now. And someone pointed out to me that there is no Southern tier representation, which I think is well noted. In terms of the demographic representation, I don't know if we did a perfect job of getting great demographic representation. I'll also point out there are 2 women on the commission only 2. There is only 1 Latina on the commission. There is only 1 Asian American on the commission, and there are 2 Black commissioners, which one of them also happens to double as the woman as well. So I don't know if we did the best job with representation, going back to that constitutional mandate of having those differences in diversity, making sure we had diversity, but this is what we got. I think there was a challenge with the restrictions around who could be a commissioner. And we at the league had even worked with a number of Latinx groups on making sure that one of the appointees was Latinx, because originally the first 8 members of the commission, there was no Latinx representation. And of course, Latinx people make up 20% of New York State's population. So it was critically important that there was at least one person representing that community. In the end, we did get that commissioner appointed, but I don't know if I would say that this is the best representation of demographic and geographical representation for New York State. So moving on, we're going to look at some of the mandates around map making. So we've got our commission in place. Now, what do they have to do? So these are some of the US constitutional mandates around redistricting currently. So in I always get tongue-tied whenever I talk about federal stuff. In Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, it requires that districts be nearly equal in population as practicable, kind of wishy-washy language. And then the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution says substantially equal legislative districts. Again, kind of wishy-washy. And then finally, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act also prohibits plans that intentionally or inadvertently discriminate on the basis of race, which could dilute the minority vote. At this point, I should also mention, when we make districts, making a district strictly based on a party or strictly based on race of the people living there is not allowed. If that happens, the maps can go to court, and those are grounds for throwing out maps and redoing maps. So all these things are grounds for taking maps to court, and so is if you're making a district solely based on political party or solely based on the race of the people within that district. So here's our new state constitutional rules. And again, they're kind of broad words: compact, contiguous, preserve political subdivisions, preserve communities of interest, preserve cores of prior districts, be competitive, not intentionally favor or disfavor an incumbent candidate or party. And I broke some of my grad school rules on the next slide because I did definitions for each of these, because similar to cracking and packing, when I first read about this, I was like, these definitions, they don't really mean anything. So what are we saying when we're talking about compactness? When we're talking about compactness, we're talking about not having districts that looked like the districts we saw earlier for the New York State Senate. We don't want something that's this weird oblong shape that kind of wraps around counties and picks up other counties. We want it to be a consistent shape, either a circle, a square, or a hexagon. That's what we're looking for when we say compact. Contiguity, as I have understood it, is that if I'm drawing my district on a piece of paper, I never want my pen to lift up. I never want to circle an area here and lift up my pen and circle an area there, and that's my district. That's not okay. Preservation of counties and other political subdivision, that one's a little more straightforward. Essentially, we don't want to split up counties, cities, or towns whenever possible. We want to keep them wholly defined, and it does make sense from the sense of, if I'm a congressman or if I'm a state senator and I'm going to advocate for funding or programs in a given locality, it kind of makes more sense if I'm representing the whole town or the whole city versus, oh, I just have this little block of the area. And then preservations of communities of interest, very similarly, if there's certain groups within a district that have things in common, again, not necessarily political interest, but it could be political interest. If it's a common church in the region, if it's a common immigrant group that all lives within this area, if everyone in this area goes to the same school district, we don't want to be splitting up those communities of interest. And then my other grad school breaking slide with lots of text on it, preservation of core prior districts. So as weird as this sounds, in many cases with redistricting, we want to preserve the districts that were already there. So if there's a district that's working well, or a community area that's working well within a district that it is good representation, we don't want to break that. Avoiding pairing incumbents is basically we don't want to pin two incumbents against each other. So we don't want to draw a district that is going to have a big overlap on either side of the district so that two incumbents may be running against each other. We also don't want to favor or disfavor a given incumbent candidate or party, which I think that one is, again, kind of straightforward. And then competitiveness. This one is probably like the most wishy-washy of all of them, but trying to make sure we have partisan balance. But again, we can't be making districts solely based on party. So it kind of starts to muddy the waters a little bit with some of these different rules around redistricting. So now that we have our rules and we've got our commission, what is the commission actually doing? So here in New York State, our commission has started to hold regular meetings. Their next meeting is this coming Thursday. Their meetings, unfortunately, they don't have a website currently. So all of their meetings are live streamed through the New York State Senate's website. And a double unfortunate here, the Senate isn't archiving any of the meetings. So if you miss it, you missed it. Luckily, we've been taking notes at the league. And so if you're on our email list, we send out those notes on meetings every single Friday. So at least we're kind of keeping people engaged. There was a big issue with the funding for the commission where they were set to get $1 million. The $1 million was delayed for a full year. When the $1 million was finally going to be released, it was being paid out as a grant through the SUNY Research Foundation, who were taking a cut of it. And they were also setting aside fees for legal fees, but it was unclear who the legal fees were for. So the league fought really hard to have in our budget, which passed in April, independent funding so the commission could hire their own staff and do their own thing and not have to be going through SUNY Research Foundation, because the Constitution says the commission should be hiring their own staff and doing their own thing and not going through some other agency. Through our work, we were able to secure $4 million in funding for the commission. As far as I know, that money has not been paid out yet, but they are working on their budget and they're expecting the money sometime this month. So some of the things they're going to need to pay for are staffing. They've already hired their 2 co-executive directors. They haven't got a paycheck yet, but they are hired and they have been working. Also, travel. The commission is mandated to have 12 public hearings at certain locations throughout New York State, which I have on a later slide. And they are technically supposed to have these hearings in person because they're supposed to represent the geographical areas within those different regions. The commission has said more likely than not, these meetings will be held remotely, but we do believe there needs to be money laid aside in case we do have in-person meetings in the later half of the redistricting cycle. And finally, software. It's critically important that the commission has adequate software. They've also floated the idea of hiring a consultant to draw their maps rather than trying to gin up a team of map makers, just hire someone who's done it before. So there's definitely a lot of cost factors in place, and that $4 million is probably going to get spent pretty quick. So now we know what they are supposed to do. We know who they are. We know the rules. What is the timeline? What happens between now and when we actually have our new district lines? So I made this handy dandy calendar, and it's funny because I've presented this training a bunch of times, and every single time I present it, I have to update the calendar because things keep changing. They keep changing all the time, but this is the basic calendar. So we are in right after April, between April and June. So we have our apportionment data. We know we're losing a seat. The commission has said more than likely they will hold their first set of public hearings in June, July, or August. And I have listed here all of the places where the commission needs to hold those hearings: Albany, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, White Plains, Bronx, Kings, New York, Richmond, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk. So the major upstate cities, plus the 5 boroughs, plus the 2 counties on Long Island, and plus Westchester. 2 Westchesters. And these hearings cannot happen unless they give 30 days notice. So the public will know when these hearings are happening. Now, if you notice here, September is when the maps have to be available, September 15th to be precise. And it might seem odd that they would have hearings before having maps, but it's actually not that unusual. And the previous legislative task force, they did have hearings and they did the same thing. They had hearings before and after the release of maps. And we think it's really important because it allows communities of interest to fill in the gaps in the census. There's things the census doesn't tell us about the people who actually live in these areas. Sure, we got your race, we know you got kids, we know that you're this many years old, we know these things, but we don't know about you is, where do kids go to school? Where do you work? Do you take public transportation? Or do you drive? Are your roads really crappy? How do we need to redistrict to make sure that we are representing you as best as possible outside of the kind of cut and dry census data? So those hearings are supposed to happen before September. The maps drafts have to come out in September. They have said they will more than likely have another set of hearings in the fall to talk about those maps. And then the plans are due to the legislature on January 1st. You might be thinking, legislature? I thought this was a commission. Yes, it is. And I waited this long to kind of break the news to you all that even though this is an independent commission, even though they're appointed by the legislature has the final say. So the legislature will ultimately give the maps the thumbs up or the thumbs down. And then the governor also gets to give the maps the thumbs up or thumbs down if he decides to veto them. So their first set of plans are due to the legislature on January 1st of 2022. If those plans are rejected, the second set of plans, they have to be told the second set of plans are due February 22nd. This is where the dates get kind of wishy-washy. And then they have to, have a new set of plans. But there isn't a set date of when those new plans are due or when the legislature has to vote on them. And for us who are really plugged into the elections and voting world, you might be thinking to yourself, isn't that when the petitioning process starts for those districts that need to be drawn? Yes. So this is a new problem since we've moved our primaries around from 2014. So our new petition process for candidates running for office, if that first set of maps are rejected, it's going to butt up right against when the petitioning process starts in February. So there is a sense of urgency here to get these maps done on time and have the first maps be the ones that are done, because we have the potential to run into the petitioning process and have petitions for districts that don't exist. So now that I've broken the news to you that the legislature does get the final say of what the commission does, I thought I would share with you the voting structure of the commission and the legislature when they are voting on these maps. So the commission itself, there's protections in here for if one party is in control of both houses. And if you remember from earlier, I mentioned that before the Senate was controlled by Republicans, the Assembly was controlled by Democrats. So they wanted to make sure that when and if the party structure shifted, both parties would be equally protected. So right now, if there are 2 different parties that are in charge of the Senate and Assembly, let's say it's the old way and the Senate is Republicans, the Assembly is Democrats, you only need approval by 7 commissioners with at least 1 member appointed by each of the legislative leaders. So we're going to have a Democrat voting for it and we're going to have a Republican voting for it in the commission, or appointee, Republican appointee, Democratic appointee, I should say. On the other hand, which this is our current system where Democrats are in control of both the Assembly and the Senate. I'm sorry, I had that flipped, didn't I? Yeah, sorry. I had it flipped. I always do this. If we have it where it's the same part or 2 different parties, then it's 7 with just each of the legislative leaders. And if we have 2 different parties, then the redistricting plan requires approval by at least 7 commissioners, including at least 1 appointee by the Assembly Speaker and Senate leader. So either way, we have to have the minority party give their input when we're approving these maps. Now, there's also the option that if the commission is a stalemate and they don't have any maps by January 1st, the legislature will basically take the plans that the commission has done so far, the one with the highest number of votes of support, and then they will get to work on that plan and put it forward for a vote. And if there is the event where the two plans that have the same highest number of votes, or there are two plans with the same highest number of votes, then the commission will give both of those plans to the legislature to vote on. So again, I explained it backwards, but the main thing essentially to know is that regardless of who are the parties in power, there always needs to be the adjacent party participating in the voting process so that it's never just one party having the final say. So as far as on the legislative side, if the Assembly and Senate leaders are of two different parties, then the redistricting plan requires approval by a majority of members in each house. If they are the same party, then the redistricting plan requires two-thirds of legislators in each house vote in approval. And then on the other hand, if the commission cannot agree on a plan and it's two different parties, then you need 60% of the two houses to approve it. But if it is the same party and they don't agree on the plans and they get those maps from the commission, then again, they need a 2/3 vote to approve them. So again, we have here, we're protecting both parties' interests and making sure that they're on equal footing and that one party doesn't have the upper hand over the other. So now we can talk about how we can get involved in this. Now we've got all the facts. We know when it's happening, we know the rules, we know who the commissioners are, we know they're having meetings, we know they're getting money soon, hopefully. So now what can we do? How can we get involved? So the League has been doing a number of public programs engaging the public in learning how to use mapping software. I have 3 examples here: Representable, Dave's Redistricting app, and District Builder. There's also District R is a free program, and these are all free. They're all accessible on. Representable is my personal favorite one. It is essentially a Google map overlaid with census blocks, and you can click census blocks to create your community of interest. So you can click the library where you go to get books, and you can click the school where you go, where your kids go. You can click your office, you can click the grocery store you shop at, and you can essentially map your community of interest, again, on a Google map, basically. It looks like a Google map. You can see everything. You can see parks, you can see games. Such a great tool. Dave's Redistricting app is a lot more intense. It's for true map makers. They have a lot of excellent tutorials on YouTube, but that one is one that if you really want to dig in and you want to play with population density and you want to play with all kinds of the nitty-gritty census data, you really want to dig into redistricting, Dave's Redistricting app is fabulous. And District Builder is kind of a combination of the two. District R is also very similar, a combination of the two, where it's community mapping, but it also has the component of digging more deeply. And they all play together. So you can upload maps from these different pieces of software to each other. So if you want to map your community of interest in Representable and then upload it into Dave's Redistricting, you can do that. And so you can see your community of interest overlaid, play with population counts. There's just so much free software out there that I don't think was available 10 years ago because of how far technology has come. We have a training for Representable archived on our redistricting website, nyredistricting.org, which I'll have a slide for next. But we are planning to do more trainings on mapping software. And I really think that if you want to kind of dig into what it really means to kind of map your community of interest and kind of see how you can make your own district lines, this is a great way to do it. We also have a resource, nyredistricting.org, where we have, in addition to some mapping software trainings and links to every single free mapping software option that's out there, we have links to New York Law School's website on redistricting, where they have more resources, particularly on county redistricting, which is so hard to find. I've Googled it many times. New York Law School has the best resources on that. We have videos of our community of interest training where we really dig into what is the community of interest, how do I figure out what my community of interest is, and then what does that mean? What does it mean to be part of a community of interest in relation to redistricting? We had an expert panel where we had 3 redistricting experts come and speak to us about some of the nitty-gritty details of what New York State can expect, what we can expect our maps to look like. Most recently, we had a people's hearing on redistricting where we had 20+ organizations come and present testimony on why redistricting matters to them and the people that they serve. And that was, again, a community of interest based fake hearing as an event. We call it a hearing, this is a cool title, where they talked about all of the different ways redistricting impacts the people that they serve within their organization. So we have lots of resources on there. We're always adding new things. So definitely check out nyredistricting.org for more information. And I will leave you with my final thoughts on redistricting, which is essentially that this is all very technical. This is definitely Redistricting 101 is the technical piece of this. The more community geared piece of this is our community of interest training, and it kind of bring it down from the macro level to the micro level of why does redistricting even matter. At our people's hearing, we had so many different groups testify about how their communities have been cracked and packed and how it's impacted their ability to influence their elected officials and even to vote for their elected officials because of the way they've been redistricted. Their vote might not necessarily count when it comes to electing a representative, and then that elected representative might not necessarily care about the issues that are most important to them. So whether it's water quality, whether it's funding for schools or hospitals, Medicaid, Medicare, or really any type of funding. Like I said earlier, if your roads are really crappy, that might be because the way you're redistricted and your elected official doesn't care that your roads are crappy because you only make up a small part of their district. Redistricting really impacts everything, and it is a 10-year commitment. So however this plays out is going to still be playing out 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you. That was great. That really put in perspective a lot of important aspects of redistricting. You know, I've been thinking about communities of interest and what that would mean. Let's on our micro level, you know, and I'm trying to put together some what would be a community of interest for us, and a couple things came to mind. Our hospital. It's possibly that we're going to be taking a rather large hospital, well, not a large hospital, but you know, a rural hospital that is, you know, a decent size in Dunkirk and moving it to Fredonia. And would that be in the best interest? I happen to work at this hospital for many years, so it you know, is sort of salient to me. You know, would that be something that was, you know, a bad thing to do? So a community of interest might be, you know, our northern Chautauqua and the fact that we don't have any healthcare facilities that are, you know, and this one might be just a little transient hospital. Another is water issues. We have some huge water issues. In my personal opinion, I don't know if anybody else here would agree. You know, do we join the water districts or do we get our water from, you know, that kind of thing? So can you tell me what you think of, I don't know, maybe someone else here can join in, what would be our communities of interest here? Anybody have any?
I think Judy's talking, but she's on mute.
Okay.
One thing that just jumped right out at me is exactly what you said, Jennifer, no representation from our area. And so how can people, we are being, when you say communities of interest, we're being excluded because in a sense, because I don't know what the other districts are like, but I didn't see anybody that was from the southern tier, Royal, and we have our own issues here that are much different than in any city. There would be the first thing. And then the second thing, Mary, and I don't know how we could capture this, but we have the highest poverty rate, Jennifer, in the whole state, in our county. And to me, that is appalling. And to me, that is we need to, I don't know, that would be an area of interest to me, because those people are definitely misunderrepresented, and our elected leaders aren't really helping, because that poverty rate has been about stable. High.
I didn't realize we were higher than Essex County, but I guess we
Yep.
are.
We're the winners. We're the poorest.
It seemed to me that it would be our goal for us to somehow encourage our community to identify themselves as communities of interest.
Okay,
And this seems to be the challenge of getting the word out to the people in our communities so they can, self-identify with these possible concerns that they have, by using whatever coalitions we have, whatever networks we have in the community, speaking with our neighbors, trying to get them fired up so that they will testify when it comes time for us to testify to the commission. We can't really decide, what these topics are without hearing from the people.
good point, Gail. Thank you.
But, that's the challenge, getting the word out to the people and firing them up so that they want to testify and talk with their neighbors where they feel that we're not being represented properly.
True. Okay. Anybody else have?
Jennifer, I've got a question or a comment. I understand that we as voters are being called upon in November to vote on possibly making changes to the amendment that was passed in 2014 regarding the Independent Redistricting Commission, and that the League has a position opposed to this. Could you suggest a good talking point when we may be asked about that position, and how we would explain the League's point of view on that?
Sure. Yeah, and actually, it'll be part of a larger, we'll have a whole campaign on this. There's going to be potentially 5 ballot referendums this year. So it'll be one of them, probably the only one we're going to have an opposition view on. But yes, so, and I didn't mention this because this is a whole nother can of worms, but there was a constitutional amendment put forward last year, passed really quickly, no public input. They had a hearing on redistricting before they put the amendment forward. So there was never talk about the specific amendment. And then they put it forward again this year in like the cover of darkness, basically, and again, passed it really quickly. We had requested a meeting with the assembly sponsor, and by the time he got back to us, or his office got back to us, they were voting on it that day. And so it was like, you didn't even give us a chance to talk to you about this. But essentially what the amendment does is it changes the timeline to produce maps, which is good. So instead of having it be where it's going to hit up against petitioning process, it'll move it closer. So it won't be that late anymore. I think like the deadline will be January or even earlier than that. I have to look at it again, but that's good. It won't impact this year, even if the legislature or even if the voters approve the amendment, it won't impact this cycle because it's already starting. So it does that. It also takes out a lot of dead language that refers to aliens in the Constitution, which is not necessary. And there's some other dead language it takes out. And it also adds to the Constitution the fact that people who are incarcerated need to be reallocated back to their last residence, which is state law. It's not in the Constitution, but that is the law of the land. So not necessary, but it is a positive thing. And then the final thing that it does is it changes the voting structure of both the commission and of the legislature itself when they're voting on these maps. So what I was talking about earlier, the 2/3, when it's both houses are controlled by one party, no more 2/3. Everything's simple majority, regardless of the party in control. And to be fair, or to be transparent, is a super majority of Democrats in both houses. With or without this, it's not gonna really matter, but it is something that's gonna matter going forward, that the
Mhm.
minority parties won't have any power. And I always feel like when I say minority party, people are like, oh, okay, Republicans, but it's not just Republicans, it's Green Party voters, independent voters, unaffiliated, it's everybody. And when you total up all the registered Democrats and everybody else, it's almost equal. So you're having basically an equal number of people who aren't going to have any say, aren't going to have any representation. So that's why we're opposed to it. It also takes away, there's bipartisan executive directors. So the majority minority each get to appoint their own executive director, which honestly, I don't know how I feel about that either, because the the Board of Elections does that, and I don't think it works that well, but well, so that's the main thing, is just making sure that we're not forgetting about any voters or any unaffiliated people in New York State who, under that new proposal, aren't going to have a seat at the table anymore.
Well, thanks a lot. That was a great overview of it. And before that election, the league will, kind of be instructing us a little more on getting the word out to the voters regarding that proposal.
Yeah, so we'll have info on that one. And then there's also going to be the Clean Air and Water Amendment, which we're a yes for. Same day voter registration, which we're a yes for. No excuse absentee voting, we're a yes for. And then there's also a bond act that's going to be on the ballot. So it's a lot of referendums this year.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jennifer. Any other questions for Jen? No? Okay. Well, thank you. That was a great overview. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and we have, I think what you were asking about initially about communities of interest, our training on that is really good. And I'm happy to kind of come back and do like a second round of just talking about communities of interest, because you're exactly right. It is that hospital. It is that issue of moving the hospital. And it may be that it's not just Dunkirk and Fredonia that, as far as like working with other areas, it might be a bigger net of people to work with than you might be thinking of, especially for upstate. I'm just so aghast at how much there is upstate. There's just so much upstate, but there's not as the same population density that we have downstate. So in some senses, it makes sense to work with counties next to your county or towns adjacent to your town, because you're going to probably get lumped in together anyway. Why not like be on the same side of things,
It's funny. It's funny how I grew up in the New York City area. And when I think of upstate, I just think of Westchester and, Albany, but I don't think of this area as upstate. I just think of us, I think anything above Westchester County or Albany area is like, the rest of us are all upstate. It's funny how people think of this as upstate, and I really don't, I just think of it as Western New York. It's kind of funny.
It's all upstate.
Yeah, if everything's upstate besides, the metropolitan New York and Albany area, I've always thought that was funny. But it's just your perspective, I guess. So, all right. If there are no other questions, thanks again. And, we'll be communicating with you. I know, we're putting some things in our public media about redistricting, and hopefully people will pay attention.
That's always the hard part.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, definitely. Well, thanks again, Jen.
Thanks
And
a lot, Jen.
we'll be seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck with your cat, Judy.